go ahead and talk about some of the things that I did not like about Jinger Duggar's book, People Pleaser. The number one thing was just the shallow exploration of some of the key topics. The book touches on deeper issues. I mentioned this earlier. Even in the section of things I did like, I constantly found myself wanting a lot more. And yes, in some ways, books can't always give you every single facet of a topic that you're interested in. But I thought there were some key things that she touched on that she didn't even give a couple paragraphs, where I think it would have been really helpful. One of the biggest ones is her book brushes against this concept of religious scrupulosity. She does not say the word religious scrupulosity in the book. And I want to be clear, religious scrupulosity is a mental health diagnosis. I am not assigning that to Jinger Duggar, and I'm not assigning it to any of you or to myself. But if you read through the symptoms of religious scrupulosity, and, I think a lot of us who grew up in fundamentalism would at least identify with a couple of the symptoms. And I think she brushed so closely against it that she should have talked a little bit about it and just explained, some of those key symptoms and what that really looks like. She kind of goes broadly and says, I felt like I needed to please God by doing this. I felt like I needed to please others by doing this. And I would have these crises of faith, and crisis of, what am I doing? And am I doing things right? And I want to talk a little bit, since she doesn't, I want to talk a little bit about what religious scrupulosity is really quickly and why I think it's important to talk about. McLean Hospital presents a really simple definition of what religious scrupulosity is. It says, while people with moral scrupulosity fear that actions won't match their own sense of what's right and wrong, people with religious scrupulosity focus on ensuring their actions match their religious or faith-based beliefs. The difference between faithful observance and religious scrupulosity arises in how someone thinks about their practice. Most people practice the rituals of their faith and then move on, satisfied they've fulfilled their religious obligations. People with religious scrupulosity, however, fear that what they do is never enough, that they are never enough, or that they have offended their God in some way. Once scrupulosity takes hold, it can gradually deepen until nothing can soothe a person's obsessive thoughts that they are bad, unworthy, or blasphemous. When someone has religious scrupulosity, their distress that they have lost touch with God or they have let their community down can be difficult to overcome. It can become severe and take over a person's life, and it can leave them feeling that they have little control over how they feel and act. Untreated, this form of OCD can eventually degrade relationships, work life, school, and family responsibilities, and the ability to find happiness and satisfaction in activities. Again, I wish that Jinger would have really dove into some of this a little bit more, because she describes a lot of the symptoms, but I think really explaining the sources of it would have been really helpful to people there. I think the book also misses some opportunities when it comes to who you should set boundaries with. She does pay lip service to boundaries later on in the book, but I think it misses opportunities to help readers recognize specific personality types or situations where boundaries are necessary. I'll recommend a book at the end of this episode that I think does a really good job explaining the different types of people and who we should set boundaries with. The other thing I didn't like in the book was that the discussion questions, what she calls, I think chat with me is what she calls them, at the end of each chapter, I felt were very surface level and elementary. And again, I think for a certain audience, maybe they'll be helpful. And I know reading some of the comments on her podcast episode, they were to some people, but I felt that they were really simplistic. And once I got a couple chapters in the audiobook, I actually started skipping some of those question sections because they felt so redundant and unhelpful to me. And then, one more thing that I disliked was just the lack of originality. This book felt like a retread of some things I'd heard growing up in religious circles, the stories of Jacob and Esau and Mary and Martha, and the application just felt so similar that I felt like I was kind of going through a greatest hits of a lot of Bible stories and really simple, simplistic application to regular life. Again, for some, they might be novel, but for myself, it felt like a regurgitation of a lot of things I'd heard in conferences growing up. And then lastly, I would say the biggest thing I disliked about the book, and again, I know I'm coming at this as someone who is spiritually not in the orbit at all that Jinger is in, is the book is very heavy-handed with its gospel presentation. Her faith is clearly central to her journey. And again, I'm not going to take points away from her for that. I think that if your faith does encourage you and help you overcome certain things, I think that can be a very valuable thing. But her presentation of the gospel in the book is woven in so heavily that the book feels largely like an evangelistic tool, especially in the last, I would say, 2/3 of the book. Like after you get out of that first, third of the book, or maybe just the last third, I don't know. Once you get 30% of the way in, that really starts taking over, and it gets stronger and stronger through the book. And for readers outside the religious circle, this is going to feel super off-putting and unhelpful. And really what I walked away from the book with was this sense that the book was really structured. If you've ever watched an evangelist like Ray Comfort doing street preaching, he'll go to someone and say, have you ever looked at one with lust in your eyes? Have you ever done this? And he'll basically break them down over the course of the conversation. And at the end say, okay, here's the solution. You need Jesus. And I feel like a really good faith reading of the book is saying, hey, Jinger experienced this. Her religious beliefs were helpful to her, and she's sharing that. But I think a more cynical reading, and it's one I struggled to stay away from, is that the book is designed not necessarily to help you, stop being a people pleaser on its face. I think it's kind of covertly, not even really covertly. It's getting you to open the book saying, I have a problem with this thing. And the book really just hammers you with, you do have a problem with this thing. You are broken. You do struggle with this. You have failed at this. You are not enough. You are this. And here's the solution at the end. And it feels like it's breaking you down to prepare you for what is a very heavy-handed gospel presentation at the end of the book. Now, again, depending on your religious beliefs, this may or may not be a deal breaker for you in reading the book. But for me, it just felt very overt and very in your face, to where essentially, the thesis of the book is like, you cannot have good relationships unless you are a Christian powered by the Holy Spirit. You cannot solve this problem without this thing. And I know they're trying to market this book to broader audiences. Jeremy even says on the podcast, like, the goal is to get this to more people than the last book, even people outside religious circles. But honestly, I think the book should be more heavy-handed in its description to tell people like exactly what this is going to be. Because by the time I got to the last few chapters, I was honestly kind of frustrated that the book was not giving practical tips for, how to set boundaries, how to stop being a people pleaser, how to self-regulate, and instead was all a build-up to this kind of final act of, now make this decision, walk the sawdust trail, so to speak. And so that was kind of the big piece there that I really found myself frustrated with near the end of the book.